The morning Harlan Yates strung his last wire across the creek bed, Roy Coleman was already standing at the fence line with her hands at her sides, looking at 40 head of cattle that had nowhere left to drink. She did not call out to him. She did not reach for the wire. She stood there in the thin May light with the wind pressing her hat brim flat against her forehead, and she counted the posts he had driven into the gravel of the creek bottom, and she counted the strands of wire, and she counted the weeks until October. Then she turned around and walked back to her house. That image stayed with the people of Laramie County for a long time afterward. The widow woman walking back across the dry grass without a word said, while Harlan stood on his side of the fence watching her go with his thumbs in his belt loops and the easy posture of a man who believed the matter already settled. The neighbors who heard the story that week assumed she would be gone by August. Cy Mabry, who ran the feed store at the edge of the county road and who had extended Roy $14 of credit through the previous winter, gave her until September at the outside. He told his wife, Agnes, that it was a shame because Nora Coleman had been a fine woman and had chosen a hard piece of ground to be buried in, and Roy seemed determined to be buried in it too. But that some facts were just facts, and a 160-acre dry-farmed homestead with no reliable water was a fact. Agnes did not say anything to that. She put a jar of preserved plums on Roy's porch 3 days later, and she did not explain why. Roy Coleman had come to Laramie County in the spring of 1879 with her husband James, a quiet man from Ohio who had read too many territorial pamphlets and believed what they said about the soil. The soil was not what the pamphlets said. It was thin and alkaline on the upper slopes and clay-heavy in the draws. And the one thing that made the 160 acres workable at all was the creek that ran through the east edge of the property from April through November, fed by snowmelt off the ridge that separated Roy's land from Harlan Yates's larger spread to the north. James Coleman died of a lung fever in February of 1881, 2 years before the fence went up. He left Roy the land, the cabin, 40 cattle that were mostly sound, a hay mower in need of a new pitman rod, and a remark he had made one afternoon in the fall of their second year, when they had been walking the south parcel looking at the low ground near the property's corner. The grass was greener there than it had any right to be at the end of a dry September. James had stopped and looked at it for a moment and said that if the creek ever gave out, they ought to dig down in that spot, that there was water moving under there. Or he did not know wet season ground when he saw it. Roy had not thought about the remark again until the morning she stood at Harlan Yates's fence and counted his posts. She was 34 years old in May of 1883. She had been running the 160 acres alone for 2 years with the help of her niece Delia, who was 16 and had come out from Kansas after James's death because Roy had no one else, and Delia had no one else, and that had seemed like enough reason for both of them. Delia was not a large girl, but she was steady-handed and quiet, with the watchful quality of someone who had learned early that watching carefully was better than asking questions, and she had taken to the work of the ranch with a practicality that Roy found more useful than any other quality she could have brought with her. Roy spent the 3 days after the fence went up doing the things that still needed doing. She fed the cattle from the stock tank she had filled before Harlan strung his wire, knowing the tank would last 4 days in the May heat before it needed refilling. She checked the hay mower and found the pitman rod still sound. She asked Delia to count the sacks of grain in the root cellar, and Delia counted them and reported back in the flat tone she used when the number was not good. 6 sacks, which was perhaps 3 weeks of supplemental feed if the pasture held. On the 4th day, Roy hitched the buckboard and drove the 22 miles to Cheyenne and filed a water rights complaint with the Territorial Land Office. The clerk who took the filing was a thin young man with ink-stained fingers who looked at the papers and said he would pass them to the appropriate deputy superintendent and Roy would hear back in due course. Roy asked what due course meant in terms of weeks. The clerk said he could not say. Roy drove home. She told Delia that evening what the clerk had said, and Delia looked at the stock tank, which was down to about 18 inches of water, and asked what they were going to do while due course ran its course. Roy said they were going to haul water from the Pemberton windmill 3 miles south until they figured out something better. Delia asked how long that would hold the 40 head. Roy said it would not hold them well, and it would not hold them forever, and that what they needed was not a better hauling arrangement, but a well. Delia looked at her without changing her expression and said, "Where?" Roy said the south parcel, the low ground at the corner where the grass ran green in September. Her husband had said there was water under it, and she had no reason to think he was wrong. Delia thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "How deep?" Roy said she did not know yet. They started digging on the 14th of June. Roy had bought a well sinker's spade in Cheyenne and a second length of rope and a wooden bucket with iron banding, and she had read what there was to read in the one book she owned that addressed the subject, which was a general farming guide published in Cincinnati in 1874 that devoted 3 pages to the sinking of hand-dug wells in clay and mixed substrate soils. The book said to expect slow going through the first 20 feet, faster through gravel if they were lucky enough to find it, and to watch the walls carefully for cracking and have a bracing plan before they needed it. They were not lucky enough to find gravel. The first 10 feet took 11 days, Roy in the shaft with the spade, and Delia above with the rope and bucket, hauling each load of spoil up and dumping it into a pile that grew through June, into a mound of pale clay mixed with small stones, and the occasional root of something that had been drinking from the seep above, which seemed to Roy a good sign. She said as much to Delia one evening, and Delia said she hoped Roy was right, and went inside to start supper. Cy Mabry came out on a Tuesday in late June with a load of grain Roy had ordered, and found them both at the well, Roy's voice rising from the shaft, and Delia hauling. He set the grain down and stood at the edge of the hole looking in, and when Roy climbed up at noon, he said that he admired her determination and thought she was making a mistake. He said the south parcel was known to be dry in the subsoil, that a man named Aldrich had tried to dig a well on a neighboring section 10 years back and hit nothing but shale at 25 feet and had to abandon it. He said the $40 Roy owed him for the grain was something he was not in a hurry about, and that the additional $34 she owed for earlier credit was also something he was not pressing, but that a woman digging a well in Laramie County in the wrong spot was going to run out of cash before she ran out of hole, and he thought she should know that the Yates family had spoken to him about the property and that Harlan would offer her a fair price. Roy looked at him for a moment. Then she said she would think on it. She drank from the canteen Delia handed her, handed it back, and climbed back into the shaft. C.I. drove away. Delia, without looking after him, reached for the rope and waited for the next bucket. They were at 20 feet by the middle of July. The clay had given way to a harder substrate, a layer of consolidated shale and compacted gravel that slowed them to 4 or 5 inches a day. Roy's hands, which had been tough to begin with from 2 years of unassisted ranch work, developed blisters under the calluses, which broke and healed and broke again, until the skin there was thick and deeply creased and permanently gray with the dust of the shale. Delia's hands at the rope were not much better. They did not talk about their hands. They talked about the cattle, about the pasture rotation, about whether the north fence needed restringing before fall, and occasionally about nothing at all, which was the conversation Roy found most useful because it meant Delia was not worried, and Delia not worried was worth something. The water rights complaint had been with the territorial office for 6 weeks, and no answer had come. Roy checked the mail at the county road box every time she drove to Cheyenne for supplies and found nothing from the land office. She filed a second notice in August, this one more specific about the legal particulars of prior appropriation doctrine, which she had read about in the Cheyenne newspaper's coverage of a water dispute in Carbon County 2 years prior. She was not a lawyer, and she said so in the filing, but she wrote clearly and she cited the Carbon County case, and she numbered her paragraphs. The thin clerk looked at the second filing with something that might have been mild surprise and said he would make sure it reached the deputy superintendent. Roy thanked him and drove home. Harlan Yates came to her fence line once during August. He did not come to the door. He stood at the fence between their properties and looked toward the south parcel, where the well mound was visible as a pale scar in the dry grass, and Roy, who had seen him from the kitchen window, went out and stood at her side of the fence and waited. Harlan said he had heard she was digging a well down there, and he wanted her to know that his offer stood. He said he had nothing against her personally, that he had always respected James Coleman, and that he thought she was a woman in a hard position, and he would give her fair market value for the property and see that she and the girl were settled somewhere with less difficulty. He said it in the tone of a man delivering news that is unfortunate but cannot be helped, as if the difficulty were weather rather than a fence he had chosen to string. Roy said she appreciated the thought. She said she had a well to finish and the afternoon was getting short. She went back inside. Harlan stood at the fence a moment longer, then walked back toward his property. He did not understand her, which was not the same as disliking her. And he was not a cruel man, only a man whose imagination stopped at the edge of what he had already seen done. At 23 feet on the 1st of September, Roy's spade turned up a thin seam of darker material, a band of clay about 4 inches wide that ran along the northeast wall of the shaft, and felt different from the surrounding substrate in the way that wet sand feels different from dry. Not wet exactly, but cooler, and with a faint cohesion that dry clay does not have. Roy scraped a handful out and held it up toward the circle of sky above, and looked at it for a long time. Then she called up to Delia and told her what she had found. Delia said, "Is that good?" Roy said it was possible. She kept digging. The seam widened over the next 8 feet and then narrowed again, and for 3 days in mid-September, Roy thought she had been wrong, that the seam was a false indication, a thin lens of moisture with nothing substantial behind it. And she came up out of the shaft at the end of those 3 days and sat on the edge of the mound with her back to the house and looked at the cattle in the north pasture, still being watered from the hauling arrangement with the Pemberton windmill. And she counted them and found all 40 present, and she thought about what 40 head of cattle needed to survive a Wyoming winter, and how long the hauling arrangement could hold. Delia had come and sat down nearby without asking anything. She had learned by then to read the particular quality of Roy's silences. And this one said, "Not yet solved, still working." She did not intrude on it. She handed Roy the canteen and looked at the north pasture too, and after a while she said she had seen 2 of the younger steers looking thin and thought they should put more hay out on the north side. Roy said she was right. They went and put hay out. If you have ever watched 2 people work through something like this, quietly and without much complaint, passing the canteen between them at the end of a hard day, you understand something about how a piece of land gets into a person. That kind of holding on is not stubbornness exactly, though it looks like stubbornness from the outside. It is more like an answer given before the question is finished being asked. At 30 feet on the 22nd of September, the shale broke open into a thin layer of water-bearing gravel. Roy hit it in the early afternoon and felt the spade go differently, felt the substrate given a new way, and she stopped and crouched in the shaft and pressed her palm flat against the gravel and held it there until she felt the coolness come up through her skin. She did not shout. She called up to Delia in a level voice and told her they had found gravel and to give her another bucket's worth of room. Delia pulled the bucket up and lowered it back empty, and Roy scooped gravel into it and sent it up. And when the next bucket came down, there was a thin shine of water on the floor of the shaft that had not been there before. Delia saw Roy's face when she climbed out that evening and didn't need to ask. What neither of them knew yet was that the gravel layer thinned again below 30 feet, and that the true water-bearing formation lay deeper still, at a depth the Cincinnati Farming Guide had not discussed, and the seam at 23 feet had only hinted at. Roy found this out over the next 3 days as the thin gravel layer produced less water than a milking cow needed, and she realized she was looking at seepage rather than a producing aquifer. She did not come out of the shaft and say this to Delia directly. She came out and ate supper and sat at the table with the Farming Guide open to the water well pages and read them again slowly. And Delia, watching from across the table, said nothing until Roy closed the book, and then said, "How much deeper?" Roy said she did not know. She said 10 feet, possibly more. Delia looked at the calendar on the wall behind Roy's shoulder, a printed calendar from the Mabry feed store with a painting of elk on the front. It was the 25th of September. The first hard freeze of a Wyoming autumn could arrive in October, sometimes early October, sometimes late, and when it arrived, the clay walls of an open shaft would begin to shift and crack, and a well that was not fully braced and capped was a well that might close itself. There was not a great deal of time. They went back to the shaft the next morning, Roy down and Delia hauling, and they worked in a pattern they had established over 3 months, rotating every 2 hours, Roy digging and Delia hauling the buckets and dumping the spoil, and then Roy resting and Delia checking the walls, while Roy ate something and drank water and flexed her hands. They pulled 12 feet out of the shaft in 4 days, which was faster than anything they had managed since the first 10 feet in June, because the substrate below the thin gravel was a softer, compressed clay again, darker and denser and full of the kind of small rounded stones that meant old water movement, and Roy knew that old water movement meant water. On the morning of the 29th of October, the sky over Laramie County came down close and gray, and the wind shifted to the northwest, and by midday the temperature had dropped 17 degrees. By 3 o'clock there was ice in the water trough. By sundown the ground was frozen to a depth of 2 inches at the surface, and the well walls had shed a thin crust of frost-cracked clay onto the shaft floor, which Roy swept carefully to the center and loaded into the bucket, and Delia hauled it up in the failing light while her breath came in small white puffs. They had reached 40 feet. They were not done. Roy came up out of the shaft that evening and looked at the cattle standing in a close group near the hay Roy had put out, their backs humped against the cold, and she looked at the stock tank, which was down to the last of what they had hauled from the Pemberton windmill 3 weeks ago, because the hauling had become impossible once the temperatures began to drop and the trail turned treacherous. 3 days of water in the tank, maybe 4 if she watched it closely. She went inside and ate supper and didn't say what she was thinking, and Delia, eating across from her, did not ask, and that was the nature of the two of them by then, which was that some things did not need to be said, because the other person had already seen the tank. The next morning was colder. The second morning of the freeze, Roy was in the shaft before full light with a lantern hung on a nail she had driven into the west wall at 20 feet, working by its orange glow. And the cold in the shaft was a different kind of cold than the cold above, not wind-driven but seeping, the cold of deep ground in early winter, and it came up through the soles of her boots and through the knees of her trousers, where she crouched to clear the loose material from the shaft floor. Delia's voice came down every 20 minutes or so, checking, and Roy's voice went back up, level and clear. which was the signal that meant still working. At 42 feet, Roy's spade hit something that rang differently from clay or shale, a low, hollow sound that a spade makes when the substrate beneath is not solid. She stopped and crouched again and pressed her hands flat against the floor, as she had done at 30 feet. And this time the coolness that came up through her palms was not a seepage coolness, but a deeper and more certain one. The coolness of water present in quantity, moving slowly through stone. She scraped the top layer back with the flat of the spade and found the gravel below it wet, genuinely wet, with water wicking up around the spade blade and pooling in the low spots of the shaft floor. She pressed both palms down and held them there in the cold and the lantern light, and she said nothing out loud. But Delia, looking down over the rim 43 feet above, saw the still quality of Roy's shoulders and the way she did not move for almost a full minute, and understood. Then Roy called up and said to send down the bailing bucket. The water came slowly at first, the way water does when it is finding its new path, filling the shallow depression Roy had cleared around the base of the shaft, by small increments, rising a quarter inch in 20 minutes and then a half inch in the next 20. And Roy stood in the water, which was at her ankles on the third morning of the freeze and had stained the leather of her boots to the knee, and she ladled it into the bailing bucket, and Delia hauled it 43 feet to the surface and poured it into the wooden trough Roy had dragged out from the barn and set near the shaft. The trough filled in pieces. The first cattle to reach it were the two thin steers Delia had noticed in September, who put their noses in and drank with the steady, single-minded purpose of animals that know water when they find it. Roy did not come out of the shaft until the trough was full. She climbed the rope hand over hand in the mid-morning of the 2nd of November, 1883, and stood on the frozen ground at the top and looked at her cattle drinking. And her hands were so stiff from the cold and from 3 days of bailing that she could not fully close her fingers, and Delia took both her hands and pressed them between her own and did not say anything. The cattle drank. The trough held. The well did not stop. Roy went inside and changed her boots and came back out and looked at the well for a moment, the rope still hanging over the timber frame she had built across the shaft rim. And then she walked to the barn and began her afternoon chores. The cattle needed hay. The north fence had a post that had heaved in the freeze. There was firewood to split before the next storm came in. She did not ride to any neighbor's property to report what she had done. She did not go to the feed store and announce anything to Cy Mabry. She simply had water and her cattle were drinking, and winter was coming and there was too much work left to stop and make a speech about it. Word reached Cy on its own, as word does in a county of that size, carried by a man named Telford who had been driving past Roy's south parcel on the county road and had seen the trough and the cattle and the timber frame over the shaft and had mentioned it to his wife, and his wife had mentioned it to Agnes Mabry, who put another jar of preserved plums on Roy's porch the following week, this time with a short note that said she was glad about the water and hoped the winter would be mild. Roy read the note and set it on the kitchen table and left it there for a week before she put it in the drawer with the other papers she kept. Cy came himself in mid-November with a load of hay Roy had ordered on credit. He unloaded it and then walked down to the south parcel and looked at the trough and the well and the timber frame, and Roy came out and stood nearby and let him look. He said nothing for a while. Then he said that he had been wrong about the Aldrich well and wrong about the south parcel, and he supposed she had known something he did not. Roy said her husband had mentioned the wet season grass, and she had trusted him. Cy nodded. He looked at the cattle, which were in good condition despite the cold, and he looked at the well frame again. And then he said that the $74 she owed him, the $40 for the last grain delivery, and the $34 from before, was something she could pay in the spring when the cash came in from the cattle sales, and there was no interest charged, and that going forward she had the same credit at his store that any other running ranch in the county had. Roy thanked him. She meant it. $74 wasn't a small thing in Laramie County in 1883, and his saying there was no interest charged was the kind of plain honesty that cost a man something in a narrow-margin business, and she recognized it for what it was. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was hard by any measure, as Wyoming winters tend to be, with 3 major storms coming through in January and a cold stretch in February that held for 11 days at temperatures no one in the county recorded with any pleasure. Roy lost no cattle. She and Delia ran the hay out daily and kept the well clear and hauled water from the shaft into the trough each morning before the trough could freeze solid, and they split and carried enough firewood to keep the cabin warm through the worst of it. And in the evenings they sat at the kitchen table near the stove, and Roy read from the one novel she owned, a battered copy of a book of stories she had brought from Ohio, and reread so many times the spine had given out, and she kept it together with a strip of rawhide. Delia mended tack and listened. Some nights neither of them read or mended, and they just sat with the sound of the wind outside and the warmth of the stove between them, which was enough. By April of 1884, the spring cattle sales had come in, and Roy drove to the feed store and paid Cy Mabry the $74 in full, cash on the counter, no note required. Cy took the money and counted it and wrote out a receipt and handed it to her, and Roy put it in her coat pocket and said good morning and went out to her buckboard. Agnes was on the porch of the house attached to the store, and she said it was a fine spring day. Roy agreed that it was. She drove home. In May of 1884, a letter arrived from the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, signed by a deputy superintendent whose name Roy did not recognize, ruling that the fence Harlan Yates had erected across the creek bed in May of 1883 constituted an illegal obstruction of a prior water use right established under Wyoming territorial law, and directing him to remove it within 30 days or face formal proceedings. The letter had taken just over 12 months to arrive. Roy read it at the kitchen table on the morning it came, with Delia sitting across from her eating breakfast and watching her face. Roy finished reading, folded the letter once and set it on the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said the land office had ruled in her favor. Delia asked what she was going to do about it. Roy said she was not going to do anything about it. She had water. She had always had water. The creek could run free or it could run fenced, and her cattle were going to drink either way. Delia looked at her steadily and then went back to her breakfast. Harlan removed the fence before the 30 days were up. Roy saw the posts pulled and the wire rolled when she rode past the creek line that June. The gravel of the creek bed open again, and the water running through it in the thin, clear way it ran in early summer. And she looked at it from the saddle without stopping, and rode on. She never spoke of it to Harlan directly, and he never spoke of it to her. They were neighbors for the rest of his working years, which were not few, and they greeted each other civilly at the county road and at the feed store, and occasionally helped each other when the frontier required it, which it did, because the frontier required everyone to help everyone eventually. And a fence across a creek bed was a smaller thing in hindsight than it had seemed in the spring of 1883. Harlan was not a bad man. He was a man who had done a small wrong because he had not believed Roy would answer it, and had been wrong about that, and had had to live with being wrong in a county where everyone knew the story of the woman, and her well. He carried that more heavily than Roy knew, and it was good for him in the end, though it was not a comfortable kind of good. Roy farmed and ranched the 160 acres for 28 more years, through dry summers and heavy winters, through cattle markets that dropped and recovered and dropped again, through the slow change of Wyoming Territory into Wyoming State in 1890, which she noted in her almanac with a single line of her careful handwriting and did not otherwise remark upon. She put in a proper stone well casing in 1887 when she had the cash for it, and she planted a row of cottonwood along the south fence that grew in the way of cottonwood, fast and generous, and gave her a windbreak she had not had before. She added a room to the cabin in 1891 and a proper barn in 1895, and she bought a new hay mower in 1898 and kept the old one in the back of the barn because she disliked throwing away a thing that still worked. Delia stayed. She was not a girl anymore by 1887, and by 1892 she had married a quiet man named Abert, who had come to the county as a hired hand and proved himself over 2 seasons to be the kind of person who was worth keeping, which Roy recognized and respected. Abert took Roy's name for the ranch purposes, which had been Delia's idea and which Roy had accepted without ceremony. Delia and Abert raised 2 sons on the land, the older of whom took to cattle with his grandmother's practicality, and the younger of whom turned out to have a gift for the mechanics of windmills and water equipment, which Roy found pleasing in a way she did not explain but which Delia understood, given the well. There was a small county newspaper in Laramie County by the late 1880s, and it mentioned Roy occasionally in the way that county papers mention the people who have done a particular thing that the county remembers. Once in 1888, when she drove 100 miles to the territorial cattlemen's meeting and spoke about water rights law to a room full of men who had not expected to hear a woman speak on that subject and found themselves listening anyway, and once in 1903 when a reporter came out to write a piece about women running ranches in the new state and photographed Roy standing by the well frame with her hands at her sides, the valley behind her and the cottonwoods to her left, and 40 head visible in the far pasture. The photograph ran in the paper. Roy looked at it once and put it in the drawer with the other papers. Cy Mabry retired from the feed business in 1898, and his son took it over, and the new Mabry extended Roy credit without any conversation being necessary, because the account had never been laid after April of 1884, and everyone in the county understood what that meant. Agnes Mabry outlived Cy by 6 years and came to Roy's table for tea twice a year until she could no longer make the drive, and Roy drove to her instead until Agnes was gone in 1907. The jars of preserved plums had multiplied over the years into a quiet tradition that neither of them had ever named, and when Agnes died, Roy planted a plum tree along the south fence near the cottonwoods, which bore fruit for the first time in 1911 and has continued to bear fruit in good years ever since. Roy Coleman died in the late summer of 1911, 2 weeks past her 62nd birthday, of a heart complaint that had been troubling her for the better part of a year, and that she had mentioned to Delia and to no one else. She had worked through most of that year in a reduced capacity, which for Roy meant she had stopped splitting wood and left that to Abert, and she had stopped riding the full fence line alone and ridden it with Delia instead. And she had spent more time than she used to sitting on the porch in the evenings looking at the valley, which was not a thing she had done much when there was always something else to do. Delia had noted the porch sitting and understood it. She had not tried to change it. Roy was buried on the south parcel rise, above the well, in a spot she had chosen herself and told Delia about the previous winter, standing out there one cold morning looking at the valley below and the mountains beyond, and the long grass already gone tawny with the first frost, saying that this was a good place to look at things from, and she supposed it would do. Delia had said she supposed it would. They had stood there together for a while, the cold air moving between them and the valley lying still in the early light. And then they had walked back down to the cabin because there was work to do. There was always work to do on a 160-acre homestead in Laramie County, and Roy had never been the kind of woman who let a good piece of land wait on her. The well on the south parcel was drilled down to a proper case depth in 1914 by Delia's younger son, who by then had the tools and the knowledge for the job, and it reached 60 feet before it hit the main formation, which turned out to be a sandstone aquifer of the kind that does not vary much with the seasons. The 43-foot shaft Roy had dug by hand was filled and capped at the surface, but the timber frame she had built over it stayed upright for a long time because no one got around to taking it down, and then it stayed because no one wanted to. It stood on the south parcel rise above the ranch buildings and the cottonwoods and the plum tree, weathered gray and perfectly vertical, in the way of things built by someone who intended them to hold. Some mornings in late October, when the first frost had come down and the valley was still in the early light, Delia would walk up the rise and stand at the old frame for a few minutes before the day's work started. She did not make a ceremony of it. She just stood there and looked at the valley, at the grass and the cattle and the cottonwoods Roy had planted, and then she walked back down and got to work. Her sons grew up knowing that the walk was something their mother did and was not to be interrupted, and they honored that without knowing exactly why, which is how most of the true knowledge of a place gets passed on, not in explanations, but in the habits of the people who kept it going. The marker on Roy's grave says her name and the years she lived, and below that Delia had a stonemason add 4 words that were not from any scripture, but were, as Delia explained to the stonemason, simply accurate. She found the water. The valley is still visible from that rise on a clear day, exactly as Roy said it would be. The grass running green along the creek line in spring and the mountains standing in the far distance, and the whole of it laid out the way the land lays itself out, for the people who have learned to read it. The plum tree bore well again the year Delia's oldest grandson was born, which was 1928, and he grew up eating the fruit of it and knowing without being told exactly where it had come from, which is the way of orchards planted by people who think longer than a single season and know that the best things you put into a piece of ground will outlast anything you took out of it. If you have sat with a story like this one long enough to feel its full weight, share it with someone who would appreciate it. Leave a word in the comments about a person you have known who held on longer than anyone thought they could. And if you want another story from this country and this time, there are more here, each one about ordinary people in an unforgiving place who found out, slowly and at real cost, what they were made of.